Well, hi, Mick Brown.
How do you do?
All right. Mick, what makes Spector the most successful pop music producer of all time, and what is the wall of sound?
Well, Phil Spector is a very interesting person in pop music history. He provides, in a way, the missing link between Elvis Presley and the Beatles in the history of pop. So that period between 1958-59 and the British invasion in 1964 is the period when Phil Spector was really preeminent and probably the most important, the most significant figure in American rock and roll. And I think why he was so important was because he was the first record producer to really conceive of pop music as being art. At that time, in the early 60s, most people regarded pop music, even the people who made it, regarded pop music as something ephemeral, here today, gone tomorrow, fly by night, it'll never last. Spector saw pop music as art, and he brought to the making of the records an artistic sensibility and a sense of making something that would endure, something that would last. He loved classical music. He loved Sibelius, he loved Tchaikovsky, he loved Mozart. And he really approached his records, you know, as if he was making symphonies. And in fact, he called them little symphonies for the kids. He wanted a sound in rock and roll that was as grand and as grandiloquent as classical music. And that's where the wall of sound came from. In those days, we have to remember that recording technology was very primitive compared to what it is today. All of those Spector records were made on 2-track, 3-track equipment. He wasn't able to overdub instruments, so what he had to do was to actually use a process of augmentation. So instead of having one guitarist or two guitarists on a session, he would have 6 guitarists. Instead of having one piano, he'd have 3 pianists. On top of that would be the brass section, then the strings, more backing singers than you could conceive of, all crowded round one mic in this tiny, tiny, tiny studio. Then this garnish of percussion, and then finally, like garlic on a great Italian meal, the echo, which gives the Spector sound its resonance, this kind of cavernous sound that he was able to achieve.
What are some of the hits, the best known hits?
Well, the best known hits would be Be My Baby by the Ronettes, Baby I Love You by the Ronettes, Do Ron Ron by the Crystals, Then He Kissed Me, also by the Crystals, You've Lost That Loving Feeling by the Righteous Brothers, which is still the most played record ever on American radio. Been played more than 9 million times on American radio. No other song has surpassed that. River Deep, Mountain High by Ike and Tina Turner. And then later on in his career, of course, he worked with the Beatles and produced Let It Be, or should we say completed Let It Be, the album which the Beatles have more or less abandoned. Spector was brought in to salvage that, and went on to work with John Lennon, produced 2 John Lennon albums, including Imagine, and George Harrison, All Things Must Pass, which included My Sweet Lord, of course. So, interestingly, the most successful solo Beatles records were also produced by Spector.
Well, now, Spector said something to you in an interview in 2002, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
What was it he said to you that sort of haunted you?
So many things he said that haunted me. I don't know quite which one you mean, but
he said he was insane. He told you he was insane.
Well, yes. I mean, I had the most extraordinary meeting with Phil Spector, and to give some background to that, what actually happened was that Spector hadn't given an interview in many years, and had effectively become a recluse, a sort of Howard Hughes-like figure. You know, had shut himself away from the public eye and from public scrutiny. And I was able to get an interview and went out to Los Angeles and met him and went to his castle in Alhambra, in this rather nondescript suburb of Los Angeles where the castle is situated. And we had the most extraordinary conversation, and in the course of this conversation he talked very candidly and very freely about all of the mental difficulties and the mental problems that he'd had over the years. And he described himself as being perhaps relatively insane. He talked about having demons inside. He said, I've not been well, I've been crippled inside. So this extraordinary sort of confession really about his mental instability and the troubles that he'd had in the past. But I should emphasize that he really did talk about this in the past tense, and the sense that I got was that he'd struggled very hard to put these difficulties behind him And the phrase that really resonated with me, that he kept repeating, was, "Now I just want to be a reasonable man. I'm trying to be a reasonable man." And this interview was published in the Telegraph magazine in London on February the 1st, 2003. And it was 36 hours later that Spector walked into the House of Blues, met Lana Clarkson, and 2.5 hours later that she was shot dead in the hallway of the castle where I'd interviewed him.
What made you write the book, Tearing Down the Wall of Sound?
Well, I must say that this sort of curious synchronicity of having landed this interview and of Spector speaking as candidly and as fascinatingly as he did, the juxtaposition of that, then the killing coming so close on the heels of that, I did feel in a curious way that I still can't quite describe. I felt sort of implicated in his life in a peculiar sort of way. And it was really that drove me to want to explore deeper into his life and to find out more about Spector. What had made Spector the man he was? What were the circumstances that had brought Spector to this tragic impasse? And
what are some of the tragedies that you uncovered in doing your research, the early life especially? Yeah, I think
Spector has had a very unhappy life and has been a very unhappy man for much of his life. Born in New York, into sort of lower middle class, working class family, Jewish family. His father was an iron worker who killed himself when Spector was 9, which in itself must have been devastating. So he was left to be brought up by all accounts, a very oppressive, overpowering mother who alternately dominated him and smothered him, suffocated him with love. An elder sister who was a sort of miniaturized version of his mother, if you like, who herself in later life would end up in mental institutions and had a history of mental problems. The family moved to California, and Spector was like a fish out of water in California. You know, he was a small, unprepossessing boy, suffered from asthma, borderline diabetic. He wasn't sun-enriched and vitamin-drenched in that archetypal California way. Absolutely, and he was you know, a schoolmate described him as a social isolate. He was the outsider. He was the little nerd that nobody wanted to play with. But he had this one extraordinary gift, and this gift was music. And music was the gift that he was able to use to somehow redesign himself, to redefine himself, as it were, and to find a place for himself in the world, or rather, to create his own world. And while he might have been the small put-upon person in the outside world, in the studio, he was God commanding his own universe. And I think that really is the key to Spector's early success. And music became, in a way, and success became his revenge against the world. It was as if he was kind of flinging his success back in the face of everybody who'd ever laughed at him, back in the face of his father who'd abandoned him, in the face of his mother who'd bullied him. So I think there's a very interesting psychology going on there. But he said to me, you know, people look at my life and envy me, and people say they want to be Phil Spector. Believe me, you would not want to be Phil Spector. My life has been a very, very unhappy life. So at that point in his life, he was obviously very mindful and spoke very insightfully about his own psychological condition and about the troubles that he'd had. And I can't emphasize this enough, but also with what seemed to me, you know, a very kind of honest determination to have put those behind him and to finally be a reasonable man. And of course, the one thing that wasn't to be the case.
No. We meet some fascinating people in your book. Who are some of the people that we meet along the way?
Well, Spector worked with so many extraordinary people and crossed paths with so many extraordinary people, some of them known, some of them not so well known. Arma Ertegun, who is probably the most famous, if not probably the most famous record man in America, I would say,
Yes.
was a great influence on Spector's life. Spector was sort of apprenticed to Armit when he was 20, when he came back to New York in 1960 and worked with Armit. Actually became Armit's playmate, and Armit was very kind of fond of Spector, and Spector idolized Armit. And Ertegun, particularly Ertegun's Atlantic Records, provided a model, I think, for what Spector wanted his own record label to be. This very high quality operation where every record is stamped with a seal of quality. That was what Spector wanted for his own record label. So Armit was a very influential character, and of course a fascinating character to meet, as was his partner Jerry Wexler, who again, one of the most preeminent rock and roll R&B producers in American music history. Fascinating to meet so many of the people, the musicians who worked with Spector, and the singers who'd worked with Spector as well. Lala Brooks, who was 15 years old when she sang "Then He Kissed Me," which was a great hit for the Crystals, and Lala rather amusingly said that she sang this line with all of the feeling that she could muster, at the back of her mind thinking, well, when am I ever going to be kissed? I've never been kissed by a boy. I'm 15 years old. And so there were lots of sort of lovely stories like that.
Yeah.
And then of course some not so lovely stories, the other side of Phil Spector's life, stories of people who'd had.
What about his wife Ronnie? I mean, how did he treat her?
Well, he didn't treat Ronnie very well. I mean, that's a very dark chapter in Spector's life. He something that characterizes him is that he's always had, I think, a very proprietorial attitude
Right.
to the women in his life, and that was particularly true of Ronnie. When they married, she married him, I think, in the expectation that she would become a great solo star, that she would break free of the Ronettes and become Veronica, a great solo star.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that wasn't to be the case. When they married, he immediately took her out of the recording studio, and by her account anyway, she became virtually a prisoner in her own home, and it was a very unhappy, very miserable relationship. She turned to drink, and it eventually ended in a very acrimonious divorce. When I spoke to him about Ronnie Spector, he couldn't even bring himself to say her name. It was my ex-wife. He couldn't bear to say Ronnie.
Well, now the verdict is still out, of course, in the murder case. From your perspective, is he mad, or is he a genius, or what is your dominant impression?
Well, I think he's probably both those things, and it's a very fine line between madness and genius, and eccentricity and genius. Is he mad? Well, by his definition, the way he defined himself was that he has bipolar condition. Now, whether that is clinical madness is not for me to say. He also said, I take medication for schizophrenia, but I wouldn't describe myself as schizophrenic, which is a rather odd thing to say, I think, and he didn't elaborate on that. But clearly, yes, he's someone who has been very, very troubled, with emotional problems, psychological problems throughout the years. And it's only in recent years, I think, that he'd really begun to address those and to seek out medication and treatment, to try and bring some kind of stability and equilibrium into his life. Quite how that plays into what actually happened on the night of February the 3rd, that's unfolding at the moment in the trial, and I think it's too soon to make a conclusion, about actually what happened on that night.
Sure. In addition to being a journalist, you're also a broadcaster, and you're the author of 4 books. What was the most difficult thing for you in writing this book?
Well, I think the difficult thing was to try and chart a true and honest course through Spector's life, and what I was anxious not to do was to fall into the stereotypical idea of Phil Spector as the gun-toting madman You know, I didn't want to just sort of reinforce the easy stereotype, because he's a much more complex character than that. And I really wanted to try and find the humanity in Phil Spector and to humanize him. And there have been, you know, episodes in Spector's life where he's been, to all intents and purposes, you know, a normal Joe. There's you know, this period in the 1980s when he withdrew from music, was in a very stable relationship, had 2 children, brought up these children, and did normal dad things. You know, the so-called gun-toting maniac was doing nothing more transgressive than playing with his children on the lawn and taking them to the car wash and the supermarket.
Wow.
And that too came to a tragic end when his son Philip Jr. died of leukemia at the age of 10. So he's someone who really has had, you know, very, very difficult and painful things to have to deal with in his life. And I would hope that what the book gives is a much more complete and human picture of Spector than the easy stereotype.
You have interviewed many creative people, Salvador Dali, James Brown, the Rolling Stones, and you really seem to me to get to a very deep level of these personalities. How do you achieve that?
Thank you. Well, I'm enormously flattered that you should say that. What always drives me, what has always driven me as a journalist is curiosity about people and wanting to understand people and wanting to listen to people's stories and wanting them to tell me their stories. And I think, you know, most people at some level, they want to share their stories, they want to tell you their stories. And so I think if you engage with people, you know, in as open and as honest a way that you can, I think that's a basis to try and build some sort of relationship.